The crystal glass sweated in my hand, cold and slick, leaving a faint ring on the white linen as if it were already marking time. Salt clung to the cuffs of my jacket, ground in by decades of mornings on deck, habits that never quite leave you no matter how many times you change clothes. I was 72, retired in name only, sitting in a waterfront restaurant on the night the final papers were signed and my fleet stopped being mine. The room was filled with voices that sounded celebratory without feeling sincere. Across the table, my nephew laughed too loudly, leaning back as if he already owned the place. He spoke in future tense, careless and confident, talking about what we would do next, how money should be handled. No one corrected him. I didn't either. I watched, listened, and kept my hands folded around the glass dot on the surface. It was a family dinner. Beneath it, something strained and sharp pressed against my ribs. Then a shadow fell beside my chair. A young deckhand stood close enough that I could smell the sea on him. He leaned down and spoke softly. "Sir, your nephew just dropped something in your glass." I looked at the clear liquid, suddenly aware of how carefully I had been holding it, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ice. What appears clear, I realized, isn't always safe to swallow tonight. I grew up where the docks were closer than the schoolhouse, where the air smelled of rusted chains and old fish, and men learned early that comfort was something you earned later, if at all. My father believed work should come before words, so I learned to tie knots before I learned to write my name properly. By the time I was 10, mornings meant hauling nets, not cartoons, and I understood that the sea rewarded effort but punished carelessness without apology. I built my first boat in my 30s, a patched-together thing held by stubbornness and borrowed money. Over the next 40 years, I added to it slowly, one vessel at a time, never farther than I could afford. I lost boats to storms that came out of nowhere, watched waves tear years of labor apart in a single night. Each loss left a debt behind, and each debt took years to settle. I paid them all. Not because anyone was watching, but because unfinished obligations have a way of following you. Fairness became my compass. If a man worked, he was paid. If he made a mistake, he owned it. I trusted written contracts more than handshakes, not because I distrusted people, but because memory is fragile and money makes it weaker. Loyalty mattered, but patience mattered more. I learned to wait, to let tempers cool, to let the truth surface on its own. Family was more complicated. My brother's son, my nephew, drifted in and out of the business over the years. He liked the title, liked telling people he came from a fishing family, but he never stayed long enough to blister his hands. He wore clean boots on deck and checked his phone more than the weather. When my brother died, the family quietly decided the fleet would one day be his. No one asked me. They assumed blood was the same as sweat. The truth was simpler and less romantic. I never promised him the fleet. I promised to run it responsibly, to keep men employed and boats seaworthy for as long as I could. That promise was to the work, not to inheritance. I never married, never had children of my own. The boats became my legacy, and the crew my extended family, bound not by name but by shared mornings and shared risk. I didn't measure success by applause or headlines, but by quiet consistency. Seasons came and went, and I learned to read people the way I read tides, slowly and with caution. Some showed their depth early, others only when pressure rose. I kept ledgers clean, engines serviced, and promises limited. When profits were thin, I tightened my belt before cutting a man's pay. When profits were good, I spread them carefully, knowing luck is temporary. That discipline shaped how I saw ownership. Nothing truly belongs to us forever, we are only stewards for a while. The boats carried my name on their hulls, but they carried other men's lives in their holds. That responsibility weighed heavier than pride. Age made that weight clearer, not lighter. I felt it each time I climbed the gangway a little slower, each time the sea asked more than my body could give. Planning for an ending became part of honoring the beginning. It taught me to choose timing over impulse, and restraint over vanity, even when no one else understood the reasons behind those choices. Selling the fleet wasn't an act of greed. It was the last responsible decision I could make. I told the family about the sale on a Sunday afternoon, after lunch, when plates were still on the table and no one could accuse me of choosing a dramatic moment. $5.5 million, paid by a commercial buyer who wanted the boats, the permits, and the reputation that came with them. The words landed quietly at first, then spread through the room like heat. Pride showed on their faces, but it didn't last. Something sharper replaced it almost immediately. Questions followed that weren't really questions. How soon would the money clear? Who was handling the paperwork? What plans I had next? My nephew's eyes stayed bright, calculating, already rearranging the future in his head. He clapped me on the shoulder as if we were partners, as if the decision had been mutual rather than mine alone. I let it pass. I'd learned that excitement reveals more than interrogation ever does. Within days, his tone changed completely. He mentioned conversations with lawyers I hadn't authorized, dropped their names casually, as if I'd forgotten to include him. He asked, more than once, what his cut would be, saying it with a smile that suggested the answer was obvious. In public, he referred to the fleet as ours, correcting people who spoke only to me. Each word was small on its own. Together, they formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. I did. And argue. I didn't raise my voice or correct him in front of others. I listened, nodded, and kept my thoughts to myself. Instead, I made calls. I reviewed documents I'd signed years earlier and updated the ones that needed clarity. I spoke with my lawyer about timelines, safeguards, and contingencies, not out of spite, but prudence. Calm has always been my preferred defense. The family suggested a dinner to celebrate, their idea, not mine. A nice place by the water, they said, somewhere fitting for such a milestone. I agreed, though the invitation felt less like gratitude and more like an audit. Conversations revolved around numbers, investments, possibilities. No one asked how it felt to let go of something built over a lifetime. They only wanted to know what came next, and who would benefit. Throughout the evening, my nephew watched the documents in my briefcase more closely than the menu. His questions circled back to timing, to when the wire transfer would hit, to how long banks usually took. He laughed easily, but his attention never wandered far from the idea of money becoming real. I noticed how quickly patience left him when answers were vague. It was hunger, thinly disguised. Near the end of the night, I saw him pour the drinks, generous with his own, careful with mine. It struck me as odd, a small discomfort I couldn't name yet. I watched the liquid settle in my glass and felt a quiet unease, the kind you get when a rope starts to fray but hasn't snapped. Trust, I realized, doesn't break loudly. It thins slowly, strand by strand, until weight is applied. Long before that dinner was planned, before congratulations turned into calculations, I had already taken steps no one noticed. The funds from the sale were placed in escrow, sealed behind procedures that favored patience over speed. I instructed my lawyer to delay any distribution until every document had been reviewed twice, not because I suspected theft, but because large sums deserve time to cool. Months earlier, quietly, and without announcement, I revised my will. It wasn't a dramatic act, just an orderly one, written with the same care I gave maintenance logs and tide charts. I learned long ago that preparation works best when it goes unseen. The sea teaches that lesson every day. It doesn't argue. It simply reveals what floats and what sinks when the weight becomes real. I trusted that principle more than any confrontation. The deckhand who approached me that night wasn't new to my life. He was young, barely 30, sharp-eyed in a way youth sometimes is before it learns to look away. Years earlier, he'd mentioned something offhand while cleaning fuel lines, said my nephew's numbers didn't always match the tanks. I dismissed it then, told myself it was a misunderstanding. Loyalty can blind as easily as greed. The deckhand never pressed the issue. He kept working, kept watching. I noticed how carefully he cleaned his tools, wiping salt away even when no one was checking. People, I've learned, grow careless faster than equipment. That contrast stayed with me. Throughout the evening, I watched my nephew with a quieter attention. He overpoured drinks, topping mine off before I asked. He avoided my eyes when numbers came up, suddenly fascinated by the view outside. Restlessness crept into his movements, fingers tapping, chair shifting. Nothing dramatic, nothing provable. Just signals, like changes in wind direction before a storm. I chose restraint. Accusations close doors, observation opens them. I let the night unfold, listened more than I spoke, and trusted that truth, like the tide, would come in on its own. The smallest voices, I reminded myself, often notice the biggest dangers first. The deckhand's whisper landed heavier than any shout. "Sir, your nephew just dropped something in your glass." I didn't react at first. Years on the water teach you that sudden movements only make things worse. I looked down instead, at the rim of the glass, at the way the light bent rough the liquid. There was a faint film clinging near the edge, something that didn't belong. When I raised it slightly, a sharp unfamiliar bitterness reached my nose, subtle but undeniable. In that moment the room seemed to recede and I felt the quiet certainty that whatever had been poured into that glass was meant to hurry, something that should never be rushed. I set the glass down without comment, placing it carefully beside my plate as if nothing were wrong. I caught the waiter's attention with a small nod, the kind used by men who don't want a scene. He leaned and listened, and his expression shifted just enough to confirm my concern. While the table continued its shallow conversation, I stepped away to make a call. My lawyer answered on the second ring. I told him only what mattered and he told me to wait. Calm, he reminded me, was still my strongest position. When I returned, the manager was standing nearby, quiet and professional. The glass was taken, examined discreetly and removed. No announcements were made. No one raised a voice. Somewhere behind the scenes procedures began to move. When the confirmation came, it was delivered softly, almost apologetically. Something had been added to my drink. Enough to disorient, not enough to kill. The room fell into an unnatural stillness, as if everyone sensed the shift but didn't yet know why. Nephew noticed first. His smile faltered, then vanished altogether. He laughed once too loudly and asked what was going on. When no one answered, irritation surfaced, followed quickly by anger. He accused the staff, then me, his words tumbling faster as control slipped. When the truth was stated plainly, his face drained of color. He denied it, then demanded explanations, then begged me to talk privately. The transformation was complete arrogance collapsing into something smaller and desperate. I didn't argue. I didn't lecture. I let the facts speak in their proper order. The police arrived, quietly professional and restrained, treating the situation with the same gravity I felt. My nephew believed incapacitating me would speed things up, that confusion would loosen signatures and shorten timelines. He never understood that nothing was moving without my consent. The funds were protected. The documents final. His assumed future evaporated in front of him. When he learned he had no legal claim, no inheritance waiting, his anger broke completely. There was no shouting, no dramatic collapse, just a hollow silence that spread across the table. Family members stared at their plates. Glasses sat untouched. The weight of what had almost happened settled in, heavier than any accusation. I felt no triumph, only a deep, steady resolve that this was how truth asserted itself when allowed room. No one needed to raise a voice for the power to shift. The authority I'd carried quietly for decades settled back into its place, steady and unquestioned. My nephew was led away without ceremony, smaller than he'd been moments before. The night resumed in fragments, conversations restarting without enthusiasm, as if everyone sensed something irreversible had passed. I sat there, hands folded, aware that dignity had done what force never could. The moment didn't feel like victory. It felt like containment, like stopping a breach before the water rushed in and took everything with it. It was in that silence that I understood how completely the night had turned. Control hadn't been seized, it had simply returned to where it belonged. No speeches followed, no explanations offered beyond what was necessary. The manager apologized again, the police spoke in low tones, and paperwork began its slow, deliberate march. I watched it all with a detachment earned through years of weathering worse storms. What mattered wasn't punishment or spectacle, but the preservation of intention. Nothing had been rushed. Nothing had been stolen. The safeguards held. As the evening finally drew to a close, I rose from the table, knowing the balance had shifted without a single raised voice, and that restraint once again had proven itself stronger than force. I left the restaurant. Later than planned, the harbor lights reflecting calmly on dark water. Nothing about the scene suggested chaos, yet everything had changed. The truth had surfaced without drama and the outcome felt inevitable rather than cruel. Power hadn't been displayed. It had simply moved quietly to the place it had always waited. Silence, not force, carried the moment forward and sealed the night without spectacle or regret for anyone watching closely. The room felt hollow after the police quietly took my nephew away. Faces that had been animated moments before were now slack with shock. Some avoided my gaze entirely, as if looking at me might remind them too sharply of what had almost happened. Others murmured excuses, offering weak justifications for behavior that had been nothing short of entitlement. I listened without comment, letting the words fall into the air like spent sails. There was no need to correct anyone. The truth had already done its work. I felt no satisfaction in witnessing their discomfort. Triumph is often loud, demanding applause. I felt none of that. Instead, a quiet sorrow settled over me, tempered with relief. My anger, if it existed at all, was muted by decades of patience and restraint. This wasn't a moment to punish, only to recognize that consequences had arrived as naturally as the tide. The young deckhand whose alert eyes had saved me from an incident I might never have foreseen received my gratitude privately. I offered him a position that extended beyond his current duties, a small gesture to reward vigilance and loyalty. He accepted with humility, his pride tempered by awareness that he had done only what was right. I lingered at the table long after others left, staring at the untouched glass that had almost caused so much damage. It reflected the soft light of the restaurant, perfectly clear yet heavy with the weight of nearly realized disaster. I understood then that victory, when measured in restraint and foresight, feels quieter than we expect. It carries with it a hollowness, a subtle FOMO for what might have been lost, even as it reminds us of what was preserved. Outside, the harbor was calm, the water gently lapping against the dock. Inside, conversations resumed, but they were clipped and polite, stripped of the casual arrogance that had filled the room before. Justice had arrived, not with noise or spectacle but with clarity. There was no celebration, no sense of fanfare. Only an understanding that order, patience and vigilance had prevented something far worse. As I rose to leave, the night felt both heavier and lighter at once. The family had been forced to confront truths they had ignored, while I had been reminded that responsibility often carries a quiet, solitary weight. Some victories are never loud, but they endure all the same. Justice doesn't feel like a celebration, it feels like clarity. And clarity, I realized, was all I had ever wanted. Months passed and the fleet was no longer mine. The boats, once my daily companions, now belonged to others, managed with the same care I had always demanded, but no longer guided by my hands. The funds from the sale were distributed deliberately, pensions for the crew who had labored beside me for decades, scholarships for young mariners who would carry the work forward, modest trusts for causes I deemed worthy. Nothing was left as an inheritance for entitlement alone. The money was meant to preserve effort, not reward presumption. The nephew's legal outcome was settled quietly. He faced penalties appropriate to his actions, but I offered no relish in the telling. His miscalculations had taught him lessons I had long known. Character matters more than expectation, and shortcuts often collapse under scrutiny. I felt neither gloating nor satisfaction, only a calm acknowledgement that truth, when met with patience, always finds its place. My days now moved at a different rhythm. I walked the harbor every morning, feeling the tide's subtle shifts beneath my feet, teaching young deckhands how to read wind and Ada how to respect the sea and the work it demands. Conversation had replaced confrontation, observation replaced assumption. I listened more than I spoke, offering guidance where needed and silence where it was wiser. I reflected often on what had been tested and what endured. Wealth can illuminate character as much as it can conceal it. Patience exposes the truth hidden behind bravado and greed. Respect, I realized, is not automatic. It must be earned, nurtured through integrity and consistency, never assumed because of blood or proximity. Some people measure legacy by what they take. I measure mine by what I refuse to drink.